So far in this course, we've looked at the useState hook and the useEffect hook. In this lesson, we'll be looking at another interesting hook called useRef. You probably won't be needing this hook all the time depending on what you're building, but we're going to see some examples where this hook can be very relevant. Well, first off, what exactly does this hook do? This hook allows you to create references to values that can persist between multiple renders of your components, and updating these references will not re-render your components. What exactly does this mean? Okay, let's see some examples. I have my development server currently running, so I can close it. Now, we looked at useEffect in the previous lesson. So let's say we have this two useEffect. This is the first useEffect that runs only on mount because we have an empty dependency array. And we have this second useEffect that runs on mount and also when the random dependency changes. Now let me just delete some of these comments here so that this is easier to read. Okay, I've done a bit of cleaning. So we have this useEffect and I'm just going to say mounted. And here in this useEffect, I'm going to say console log mounted and updated. Yeah, because this runs when it is mounted and also when the random color is updated. Now, if we should go to the console, we have this one that runs only on mounted, and we have this one that runs on mounted and updated. And if I should click this random color states, you see that we have mounted and updated again because this useEffect runs anytime random color changes. But now what you probably want is that you want a useEffect that would run only on mount, and this other useEffect should run only on update. You don't want this useEffect to run also on mount. That might be your use case. Now, how would you achieve that? Well, you might think of maybe using a variable. So maybe you might have a variable called let is mounted, and then you give this false. And then when this component is mounted, you can now say is mounted is equal to true. And then in this useEffect, you can now say if the component has already been mounted, then you can now run all of this. So if the component has not yet been mounted, don't run this. But if it has been mounted, then that is when you want to run this. So that way you would only be running this when the component has been updated. Another thing you need to do now is to maybe change the order. So you put this at the top, because if you have this at the top, then this already becomes true. And that means this is going to run. But then if you have this at the top, then you can first check is mounted. Oh, is mounted is false. Don't run this part. Okay, now that is mounted is true, then this part can now run on updates. But that is not going to be the case. Let's check it out. So if I refresh, is mounted is false, and because it is false, our if block does not run, which is nice. That's what we want, right? But then this useEffect runs console log mounted, and here we update this mounted variable to true. Now, what if we click on randomize colors? When we click on randomize color, this random color dependency changes, and then we expect this dependency to run, right? But watch what happens. It doesn't run. We don't get console log mounted and updated, even when the random color dependency keeps changing. Well, the problem here is that your variables do not persist from one render to another render. The first time your component is rendered, you have this variable let is mounted equals false. Fine. This if block does not run because is mounted is false. All right. This useEffect runs. You have console log mounted, and now you update the is mounted to true. Fine. But then when you click on this button called randomize color, this button calls set random color. And as we have understood so far, when you trigger a state update, it's going to cause a re-render of your component. So now this component is re-rendered again. But here is what happens. As it is re-rendered again, this variable would be created again. If you remember when we looked at useState, I mentioned that when your component re-renders, then all the functions that you created in your component would be recreated. All the variables, the objects that you created in your component, they will be recreated. So in this case, this mounted variable is created again, and it is going to have the value of false. And because it has the value of false, then this if block is not going to run anymore. And remember, this part only ran on mount. So that means the is mounted variable is not ever going to be updated to true anymore. So with variables, they do not persist from render to render. And this is where you can use useRef, because like I mentioned in the definition, with useRef, you can create reference to values that persist between renders. So what's the syntax for useRef? The syntax is pretty simple. You have your variable, let's call this is mounted ref, and then you can use useRef. Of course, you have to import it. So I'm going to import useRef from React, and then you pass the initial value that you want for that ref. So for this initial value, I can pass false. So this mounted ref now holds a reference to a value of false. Now when you have your ref is an object that has a property called current. So what I'm going to do here now is if isMounted.current, sorry, not isMounted, isMounted ref. If it is true, but I don't need to do this, I can just have it short like this, then we know that the component has already been mounted and we can now run this on updates. Then here we have isMounted ref. And how do you update a ref? You update it by updating the current property. So here I'm saying isMountedRef.current is equal to true. As I also mentioned earlier, updating your references would not cause a re-render of your component. Only thing that causes a re-render of your component is state, not refs. So here you are updating the reference to a value of true. It's not going to cause a re-render, but then this ref is now going to hold the current value of true, which would persist to the next render. So this is the very simple syntax for creating your ref. Use ref, initial value, and then in your use effect or in your event handlers, you can update the value of that ref. Now let's see if this is going to work. So our component is mounted, is rendered for the first time. We have mounted. This part doesn't run because isMountedRef.current is still false, the initial value. This part runs. We have console log mounted. We have isMountedRef.current is equals to true. So now the ref is now holding a value of true. Now watch what happens when we change the color. When we change the color, we now have this mounted and updated coming from here. In fact, instead of saying mounted and updated, I can now call this only updated. So I've refreshed now. We have mounted. When I click on randomize color, this random color dependency changes, and now we have updated. And what we have been able to achieve here now is we created a ref which has a value. We change that value from the previous render of the component, and we can access that value in the current render of the component. Unlike variables that would be recreated in every render, references are not recreated. They always have access to the previously set value. And I hope with this simple example, you can already begin to see how references are important. Like I said earlier, you might not need this all the time, but there may be specific cases like our isMountedRef case, where you want to know if a component has already been mounted, or if you want to know if a value has been previously set, or things like that. Another example where you can use this is, let's say you have a function which you call start interval, and maybe in this function you do set interval, you have your callback function, and this should run every 1 second, for example. And then maybe in this set interval, what you're doing is, let's even make this example more interesting. Let's create something like a countdown, or maybe like a timer. So we're going to say count, set count, and this is 0. Then every 1 second you do set count, and you use the current count plus 1, and then maybe you render this on the UI somewhere here. It's not going to be really fancy. Let's just do it like this. You have count, and of course you have a button that when you click on that button, the button is going to call start interval. You can remove this ID, and let me just say start interval. And then you also have a function called stop interval, and we're going to come to this function in a second. And let's say you also have a button here which is going to call stop interval, and we have stop interval. Okay, we have an error in our components. What does the error say? 0 is not iterable. What does this error mean? What am I doing with 0? Oh, sorry. Sorry, use state and 0. I just passed 0 like that. Okay, no wonder. So here we have our simple interval, timer, countdown, anything you want to call it. So you click on start interval, it calls this function. Then this function calls set interval, and every 1 second we are updating the count state. So click on this interval, we have the count state, it updates to 1, and it doesn't update to 2. There's a reason for this. I explained that in a lesson, which I'm going to link below. But because we need access to the current count, instead of doing count like 1, you want to use a callback function like count. So this is a callback function where you get the previous count and then you increase that count. The explanation for this will be linked below. If you haven't seen that lesson yet, just agree with me that this is the right way to update the count state in our case. Now we'll click on start interval. You see every 1 second we have our count state is updated 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, fine. Now we want this button called stop interval. When you click it, it should stop the interval. But for us to stop the interval, we need the interval ID. So again, if you should use a variable outside here, let's say you have interval ID, it's null. Then here you say interval ID equals set interval, because set interval is going to return an ID. And then when you say stop interval, you now call clear interval and you pass the interval ID. Let's see if this is going to work. Okay, so we refresh, our countdown or our timer starts when I click on start interval. It's going and it's going. Now when I click on stop interval, the interval doesn't stop. I'm clicking on it. You probably don't see my hand, but I'm clicking on it, but it doesn't stop. Why again? Well, that's because this variable will be recreated every time the count state changes. So when the count state changes, we have a re-render of our component. Then even if we had already assigned the interval ID here, because the component re-rendered, this is going to be recreated and it will have a value of null. So when we're calling clear interval here, what we're doing is we're passing null to it instead of the ID that is supposed to come from here. And what is a good solution for this again? useRef. So what I can do here again is to call my interval ID ref, or I'll just call it interval ref. Then I pass useRef and I pass a default value of null. Then here I can say interval ref.current is now going to hold this ID, and now I can call clear interval and I pass the interval ref.current. Because with useRef I can persist values. That means when I update this current property in the next render or in the next 20 renders, I'll be able to access that current property here. All right, let's start afresh and see what happens now. I click on start interval 1, 2, 3, 4, and I click on stop interval and the interval stops. Because I was able to get access to the interval ID by using useRef, even though the component is currently on the 20th, or in our case on the 5th render, because we called cell count like 5 times, we can still access that ref because the reference is not recreated. Unlike variables that are recreated, the reference is not recreated when the component is re-rendered. I hope this example also goes to show you how useful the useRef hook is. Now, one more thing I want to show you with refs is that you can use refs for your DOM elements. Now remember when we wanted to get this button, actually we shouldn't be having 2 buttons with the same ID. Oops, this was a mistake from previous lesson. Now remember previously when we wanted to get this button, we had to do document.getElement by ID and then we pass this button. Well, you can choose to do that, which is fine, but you can also use refs for your DOM elements. And how do you do that? Well, if you want to get this button called toggle box, for example, okay, first you need to initialize your ref. So I can come here and say toggle box ref, use ref, and I have an initial value of null. So I can come to this element and I can pass the toggle box ref. So every DOM element, when used in React, has this ref attribute, and with this ref attribute you can attach a reference. Now by attaching this reference, what React is going to do is that first the toggle box ref is going to be null. When the component is mounted, React is now going to attach this element to this ref, and now we can do whatever we want to do on that element. So for example, when the component is mounted here, I can do something like toggle box ref add events listener, and let's just add click events, and here I can say console log I was clicked. Then I'm going to come here and just remove this on click for now. So I'll just comment it. Seems we have another error again. Oh, sorry, not toggle box ref. Remember, it's the current property. You don't just do ref dots. No, it has to be ref dot current dot this, and I can update this current property at any time that I want. But the beauty of this is that this would persist in every render. So now let's open the console. If I click this toggle box, you see we have I was clicked. So instead of having to do document or get element by ID or querying the DOM in other ways, you can simply use a ref, and React would help you associate that ref to the element. Now in this case, I wouldn't be using refs for a click event because I can easily do on click like this, but there are some cases where you need access to a DOM element. Maybe you want to do a scroll into view kind of thing, or you want to do a slideshow where you have one image goes to the next image, goes to the next image, or maybe you want to get the dimensions like width and height of an element. In that case, instead of document.getElement by ID, use your ref. React helps you to associate the elements to the ref, and on your ref.current you can access that element. So let's even do a simple console log togglebox ref.current. Let's just do this. So now if I should refresh and the component is mounted, you see we have access to this element, which means we can access even the inner HTML of this element. So if I should refresh, see the inner HTML is this toggle box text. So I have access to this element, and just the same way you do your document queries, you can access different properties on that element. So these are refs. As we have seen with the example so far, they allow you to persist reference to values between multiple renders, which might be very useful depending on what you're trying to achieve. And also for DOM manipulations, they make handling element references much easier. If you have been enjoying this course so far, I would really appreciate if you give it a like, you share with others, and of course subscribe so that you know when a new lesson drops.